Hello, I'm Tom Jarrell outside the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, where thousands continue to file by the coffin of Senator Hubert Humphrey.
Chase in New York, and this is the ABC Saturday News, January 14th, 1978. Some of what's ahead tonight. The nation pays tribute to Senator Hubert Humphrey, who died last night of cancer. We'll have reports. And a review of Humphrey's 30-year career in government. Egyptian President Sadat says he's lost hope of a Mideast peace settlement. Jack Smith has details. And in sports, New Orleans gets ready for Super Bowl 12. Our top story tonight, an outpouring of tributes to Hubert Horatio Humphrey. The senator and former vice president died of cancer last night at the age of 66. Today, a presidential jet carried Humphrey's body from his Minnesota home to Washington to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Tom Jarrell is there.
Tonight, the flag is flying at half-mast over the nation's capital, the building where Hubert Humphrey labored as a public servant for almost 30 years. Inside, under the Great Dome, Humphrey's friends and admirers are filing by to pay their respects and to say goodbye. There's no likeness of Hubert Humphrey here in Statuary Hall off the Rotunda, not yet. But his impressive legislative record certainly places him among the greats of Congress. It was last night in Minnesota at his small hometown of Waverly where the Humphrey career came to an end. We have reports on the last 24 hours. First, Herbert Kaplow in Minnesota.
It was dark before most of the reporters could find their way to the lakeside home that Hubert Humphrey loved so much. They'd come from nearby St. Paul and Minneapolis, and from afar, from Chicago and Washington, alerted just a few hours earlier that the already bad situation had worsened. And yet the end seemed to come so much more quickly than they'd expected.
Senator Humphrey passed away quietly in his sleep at 9:25 p.m. today. At his bedside were his wife, Muriel, as well as his sons, Skip, Bob, and Doug, and their wives, and his daughter, Nancy, and her husband, Bruce Solomonson. The senator was comfortable throughout, and he suffered no pain. He had been in a coma prior to his death.
Shortly after midnight, a hearse carried Hubert Humphrey away from the lakeside home he loved so much. A few hours later, at the Minneapolis airport, 50 miles to the east of Waverly, he was carried aboard a plane dispatched by President Carter. It was just becoming daylight when Mrs. Humphrey arrived, his wife of 41 years, to whom he'd written way back then, "I intend to set my aim at Congress. Don't laugh at me, Muriel. Maybe it sounds rather egotistical and beyond reason, but I do know others have succeeded. You'll help me, I know." And so they started again back to Washington, to Andrews Air Force Base, where just a few hours earlier, Hubert Humphrey's most prominent protege spoke his affection and grief.
He's been a remarkable example to all of us in life, and perhaps above all, he showed us all how to die with dignity, with courage, with spirit, and with meaning. It's one of the most saddest moments in my life. I shall never forget him, and I believe neither will most Americans. Thank you.
This is Charles Gibson. It was to Andrews Air Force Base that the body of Senator Humphrey was brought this morning. His flag-draped casket was brought off the presidential aircraft that had been sent just hours earlier to Minnesota, the same plane that had carried the bodies of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson back to Washington. Humphrey was accorded honors befitting his role as a former vice president, ruffles and flourishes, and a 19-gun salute. Vice President Mondale headed the dignitaries at Andrews. He stayed close by the side of Mrs. Humphrey. The ceremonies were brief. The military honor guard placed the casket in a hearse, which then led the long motorcade taking Senator Humphrey to the Capitol. Hubert Humphrey earlier this week had talked of returning to work when Congress reconvened, but it was not to be. He now is the 25th American in 126 years to lie in state at the Capitol, Henry Clay, the first in 1852. The closed casket was placed directly beneath the Capitol Rotunda on the Lincoln catafalque, first used after the assassination of President Lincoln. The first half hour was reserved for a private family prayer service. Senate Chaplain Edward Elson spoke of Humphrey's inclusive love of all mankind. Then dignitaries and mourners who were friends of the Humphreys paid their respects. Mrs. Humphrey had a greeting and a hug for almost all of them. And finally, the Capitol was opened to those who had started lining up even before the body had been brought to the Capitol. Thousands have filed by already this evening, and the Capitol Police are going to keep the rotunda open throughout the night. Charles Gibson, ABC News, Washington.
Tonight, the rotunda stays open for viewing for all those who are paying their last respects to the senator from Minnesota. Tomorrow, there'll be a memorial service with President Carter delivering the eulogy. We'll be back in a moment with more on Hubert Horatio Humphrey. A man can't be in public life for 30 years without having adversaries, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone here in Washington who didn't like Hubert Humphrey. One colleague said of him, he defeated his enemies with love. Many were embarrassed by his politics of joy during the 1968 anti-war political campaign, but nothing could keep the happy warrior down for long. ABC's Bob Clark tells us of his life and his career.
Hubert Horatio Humphrey, the most famous Minnesotan of his time, was born the son of a South Dakota druggist who loved politics. For Humphrey, politics became a love affair that lasted all his life. He was the mayor of Minneapolis at the age of 34, the youngest mayor in the city's history. He drew his first national attention 3 years later when he led the successful fight to include a strong civil rights plank in the Democratic platform at the party's 1948 convention. Humphrey won election to the Senate the same year. By 1960, after 2 Senate terms, he was ready for his first run at the presidency, but so was John Kennedy. Humphrey lost a showdown primary in West Virginia, and Kennedy went to the White House. But by 1964, Lyndon Johnson was president, and after tantalizing Democrats with a make-believe search for the perfect running mate, he picked the man he had settled on from the start, Hubert Humphrey. The Johnson-Humphrey ticket buried Barry Goldwater under a landslide of votes. Hubert Humphrey became vice president. But this made him more Lyndon Johnson's man than his own. When he sought the Democratic nomination for president in 1968, the party was bitterly divided over the Vietnam War. Humphrey was scorned by liberals whose banner he'd carried so long. Chicago police ruthlessly quelled demonstrations by anti-war protesters, many of them supporting Humphrey's old friend, Gene McCarthy. The prize, the presidential nomination, was Humphrey's, but his acceptance speech sounded a note of foreboding.
May America tonight resolve that never, never again shall we see what we have seen.
The task of reuniting the Democratic Party against the challenge of Richard Nixon proved hopeless. Despite a last-minute surge, Humphrey lost the election and the presidency by 500,000 votes. The rejected candidate went home to Minnesota to teach political science. But the academic life was not for Hubert Humphrey, not for long. Minnesotans still loved him and sent him back to the Senate in 1970. He began rebuilding his political fortunes with his wife Muriel at his side, as she had always been.
People like her, and she's a very charming and lovely lady. She is a fine mother, and people respect that as well. Besides that, she's my pal.
Humphrey made a half-hearted try for the Democratic presidential nomination again in 1972, but that was George McGovern's year. The yearning for the presidency still smoldered in Humphrey in 1976, but he sat out the primaries until it was too late for anybody to stop Jimmy Carter.
I shall serve the party, the Democratic Party, to the best of my ability in the status of a citizen, a senator, and a non-candidate.
The prize he had coveted all his political life, the presidency, would never be his. But he was still a senator and full of plans once again for the future. Then the cancer he had fought off once before struck again. It shriveled his body, but not his spirit.
I'm running a hard battle against one of the great killer diseases called cancer. I'm not afraid to mention the name. I have the will to live, and I intend to live a long time. And more importantly, I intend to live every day to the fullest.
Indeed, Humphrey did live his last days to the fullest. He worked on the full employment bill. He counseled the new president with advice on how to get along with Congress. And tomorrow morning, President Carter will deliver the eulogy here. Also, the two former presidents, Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, will attend the memorial service. This is Richard Nixon's first trip to Washington since his resignation. ABC's Don Farmer tells us of others who remember the senator from Minnesota.
There were the official ways of remembering, revering Hubert Humphrey, the lowered flags, the prescribed things we do as a society to show respect and to deal with our grief. And there were the official people, the men who shared leadership with Humphrey and thus knew him and loved him amidst the trappings of influence and power.
So you had the feeling, you know, especially those of us who've known him for so many years, that somehow, you know, he'd survive this, that he would defeat death. And I got the feeling that if there was a man who ever lived who could defeat death, it would be Hubert.
Hubert Humphrey always, in an irresistible way, represented nothing but good.
I think he'll be remembered as a great legislator. He was a great vice president, but primarily I think he was a man of the Senate. And
yes.
He'll be remembered that way.
Yes, and as Kipling wrote about in his poem, If you can walk with kings and not lose the common touch. And here was a man who walked with kings and he never lost that common touch.
Outside Washington, people also gathered to remember, people with special memories. In Atlanta, a black congregation joined Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. in honoring that white man from Minnesota who did so much for black and white Americans.
He's not dead. Anybody who served as well as he did, as useful as he did, cannot die.
A man in the bed, weighing less than 100 pounds. The cancer had gotten to his body, but his soul and his spirit and his heart and his mind, they were all intact. As he sat in the bed, describing still yet visions for a new and a just America.
Just as Martin Luther King helped the poor and the needy in the streets, it was Hubert Humphrey that fought the battles in the Congress and translated the passions and yearnings of poor people everywhere into legislative action.
In life, Mr. Humphrey had heard such praise from such prominent people many times. Today, the people who never knew him, whom he never knew, were coming to say goodbye in the Capitol Rotunda and outside the building which Humphrey had graced for so long.
He's just basically a good person, and he was what I saw as a mediator for right. No matter where you found him, he was that man that stood up for what was right.
So I think if we can get anything out of this man for our individual lives, is how to go on from not succeeding in something.
To me, alongside with Harry Truman, he stands as the two best Americans that this country has ever had.
I think my regret is that I've always wanted to write to him and thank him personally for what I feel he's done, and I've never done it.
And so all those people who never wrote letters came here and perhaps felt better for it, for having shared their grief. There will be millions of words of remembrance for Hubert Humphrey, but Vice President Mondale said it best. He said to speak of him in the past tense is almost impossible. Don Farmer, ABC News in Washington.
Hubert Humphrey's city of Washington is a place where mistakes are often magnified and elected officials are usually more open for criticism than acclaim. In Senator Humphrey's final months, Washington also showed it is a place with heart that can accomplish some things quickly despite the bureaucracy. After the senator was told he had terminal cancer last fall, President Carter delighted him by flying him back to Washington aboard the aircraft Humphrey always wanted to command himself, the presidential jet. He, along with his wife Muriel, were welcomed back with unprecedented honors. The Congress suspended business to greet the Humphreys and to permit him to speak to both houses. He was elevated to the post of Deputy Pro Tem of the Senate, a top position created by law, especially for Humphrey. The headquarters of HEW, whose human need programs he championed, was named for Hubert Humphrey, the first such honor afforded a living senator. And friends from both major political parties and leading figures from the entertainment world assembled in Washington to raise millions of dollars for the Humphrey Library in Minnesota, a living memorial which was assured before his death. So briefly, this cold official Washington opened its heart to Hubert Humphrey as he fought the pain of cancer and the bottled death of chemotherapy treatment, as he called it. The senator also experienced a warmth that most great men never know, a compassionate farewell while he was alive from those who loved him.
As the nation mourns Hubert Humphrey, ABC News will follow the events live, beginning tomorrow morning at 10:30 Eastern Time, when President Carter speaks at a memorial service in the Capitol Rotunda. And the Humphrey family permitting, ABC News plans to broadcast live from Minnesota Monday afternoon when the Humphrey funeral takes place and the senator is buried. Then Monday night at 11:30 Eastern Time, ABC News will review the nation's final tribute to Senator Hubert Humphrey.